The auction house was packed with the kind of people Harper Lane usually avoided. Wealthy, polished, and confident. The sort who never took a second glance at a mud-stained pair of jeans or the woman who wore them. She stood at the back, her eyes scanning the stage. It was an elite horse auction, and while the others discussed pedigree and lineage, Harper's focus was elsewhere. She wasn't there to impress anyone. She wasn't there for luxury or prestige. She was there for the one nobody wanted. The gavel clacked, and a bay stallion was led into the ring. A collective murmur ran through the crowd. His coat was matted, his legs scarred from injury. He moved stiffly, his eyes filled with something no one could quite place. Fear, pain, or maybe both. "Phoenix," the auctioneer said, his voice dripping with the confidence of a man who knew this horse was as close to worthless as they came. A broken-down stallion, no records, no future. Laughter bubbled up from the crowd, the kind of laughter that didn't care who it hurt, the kind that saw Phoenix as nothing more than a joke. Harper's heart tightened. She took a step forward. "I'll bid 5,000, Harper said, her voice steady but piercing through the laughter. The auctioneer paused, eyeing her with thinly veiled amusement. 5,000? For that horse?" The room chuckled. It was a laugh meant to dismiss her, but she wasn't backing down. "I said 5,000, Harper repeated, her gaze not leaving Phoenix, whose eyes now locked with hers. He was trembling, but there was something else there too, something wild. Something that, deep down, told Harper that he was worth more than what anyone could see. The bidding went silent for a moment, and the auctioneer threw a look at the crowd, expecting them to keep the price going. They didn't. 5,000. Once, the auctioneer called, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Twice." "Sold." The gavel fell, and the room fell into a stunned silence. Harper Lane had just bought a horse. A horse everyone else had written off. The laughter that followed was quieter now, more subdued, but still echoing in her ears as she made her way to the stage. The billionaire in the front row, Richard Wexley, snorted in derision. "Hope you didn't just throw your money away, sweetheart. That horse is a liability, not a prize." Harper didn't answer him. She simply walked past him, her eyes locked on Phoenix as he stood there, trembling. She could see his ribs, the deep scars on his legs. He wasn't beautiful. He wasn't what anyone would call a winner. But Harper had never been interested in what people saw on the surface. She had seen enough of her own scars, enough of her own battles, to know that sometimes the ones who seemed most broken were the ones who had the most to give. She reached out, stroking his muzzle, feeling his flinch, but also the quiet surrender. They both had their battles, and now they would fight together. "Come on, Phoenix," she whispered. "We've got work to do." Harper Lane had never been the kind of woman to care much about fitting in. She had her own rhythm, her own pulse, and if anyone in the world would understand the rhythm of a broken-down horse, it was her. At 29, Harper was a single mom, a horse trainer, and a night shift vet tech. Her life was a delicate balance, one she barely held together, but she didn't complain, not ever. She wasn't that kind of person. But it hadn't always been this way. 2 years ago, Harper had been working side by side with her mother, Anne, at Birch Hollow Ranch. Anne was a soft-spoken, brilliant horsewoman who had taught Harper everything she knew about trust, patience, and the art of training a horse that no one else believed in. Anne had passed unexpectedly, and the ranch had felt emptier since. The steady rhythm of life had been disrupted. Leaving Harper to pick up the pieces of a farm that was barely staying afloat. She had inherited her mother's dreams, but the weight of them was crushing her. Her mother's death had left Harper not just with a farm full of memories, but with a growing sense of responsibility that made every day feel like an uphill battle. The bills piled up, the repairs went undone, and yet Harper didn't let it stop her. She had to keep going. For Josie, for the ranch, for herself. But lately, it felt like it was all slipping away. The world didn't make space for single mothers, especially not those like Harper. She had no wealth, no influential friends, no safety net. What she had was a broken-down ranch, a daughter who was far too smart for her age, and a heart full of dreams she couldn't let die. The stables were quieter now that Anne was gone. Harper had tried to keep the same schedule her mother had set, the one that turned every horse into a partner, a teammate. She'd wake up early, head out to the barn before sunrise, and spend hours in the stalls, cleaning, feeding, and simply being with the horses. But there was no magic left in the air. The horses had felt it too. Her daughter, Josie, kept asking her why the ranch felt so lonely. Harper didn't have a good answer. The only bright spot in the past 2 years had been Josie's growing love for the animals. Josie was 9, sharp-witted, and fearless in a way that Harper envied. She had inherited Anne's soft touch with the horses, something Harper, despite all her experience, never truly had. Harper's eyes were tired as she looked out the kitchen window, watching her daughter brush down a mare in the pasture. The sunlight was beginning to soften, casting a warm glow on Josie's hair as she hummed to herself, her voice a soft thread that matched the rhythm of the wind. "You're staring again," Josie said, her voice teasing. Harper didn't need to turn to know her daughter was standing in the doorway, watching her. "I'm not staring," Harper said with a smirk, but Josie had already crossed the room to stand next to her. Are we still going to train Phoenix today?" Josie asked, her eyes wide with excitement. The thought of working with the horse Harper had bought at the auction had electrified Josie. She believed in him, in the way he seemed to believe in her. Harper's smile faltered for a moment. Josie's hopefulness was both a gift and a burden. Harper knew how much her daughter wanted this to work, but there was a part of her that feared Phoenix might turn out to be another disappointment, another thing she couldn't save. "We are," Harper said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Josie's face lit up, and before Harper could even finish her coffee, her daughter was already running toward the barn. Harper could hear her calling for Phoenix, the joy in her voice a stark contrast to Harper's own thoughts. The barn smelled of old hay and the faintest trace of horse sweat. The walls were peeling, and the wooden beams groaned under the weight of time. It wasn't a glamorous place. It never had been. But it was home. And it was where Harper had spent every day of her life, the place where she and her mother had built their legacy. When Harper walked into the stable, she was met with the same disjointed noise. Hooves clattering, the soft whinnying of horses calling out to each other, the scent of leather and hay. Phoenix was in the farthest stall, standing with his back to the wall, his body stiff and wary. It wasn't easy to ignore the doubts that gnawed at her. The horse was skittish, unpredictable, and scarred. Everyone had written him off. But Harper wasn't like everyone else. She couldn't afford to give up on anything, especially not something that might still be worth fighting for. She walked up to his stall and stood there for a moment, just watching him. Phoenix's dark eyes flickered toward her, then back to the floor. He was a broken animal in a way Harper knew all too well. He wasn't just physically wounded, he was emotionally scarred, just like she was. Slowly, she reached for the brush she'd brought with her. She wasn't going to force anything on him. She was going to wait, just like she'd had with every other horse who had come through her hands. "Hey, big guy," she said softly, as if to herself. "I know you're not ready. But I promise, I'm not going anywhere." Phoenix twitched, but he didn't pull away. Harper took a deep breath and began to gently brush his coat. She wasn't going to rush him. There was no timeline, no deadline. Just the two of them, together. The days following the auction were a blur of skepticism and whispers. Harper had become the talk of Birch Hollow, though not in the way she had hoped. The town was full of people who had lived here for generations, people who knew horses, knew racing, and knew what it took to succeed. And Harper? Well, She was an outsider in more ways than one. She had walked into that auction like a stranger in a foreign land, bidding on a horse that no one had any faith in. The crowd had laughed at her, mocked her audacity, and left the event shaking their heads in disbelief. Phoenix wasn't worth $5,000, let alone the potential it would take to restore him to any semblance of what he could be. Yet, somehow, she had stood firm. The $5,000 she'd spent felt like an eternity of savings and borrowed time, but she couldn't let it go. There was something about Phoenix, something raw, something untapped, that she couldn't shake off. The barn was quiet now, save for the soft sounds of Phoenix's hooves as he shifted in his stall. Harper had spent the past few days just being near him, talking to him, getting to know him without any pressure to perform. The soft rhythm of her voice seemed to bring him a sense of calm, and though he still flinched at sudden movements, he was beginning to trust her. But the world outside had a different idea of trust. Richard Wexley, the billionaire who had ridiculed her in front of the crowd at the auction, was the one who still didn't believe. He didn't care for the horses that had no bloodline, no history. He cared for winning, for status, for the kind of success that made others bow down. The man owned the most famous racing stable in the region. Iron Ghost, his prized stallion, undefeated in every race he had entered, was the talk of the town. Wexley was a man who didn't take kindly to being embarrassed, and Harper had embarrassed him. She had heard the rumors before it hit the local papers. Wexley was furious, and he wasn't one to let a slight go unanswered. And so, it came in the form of a challenge Harper had never anticipated. The press conference was held at Wexley's sprawling estate, a place so ostentatious that Harper had to fight back a laugh. Everything about it screamed money, power, and privilege. Even the horses in the stable had the same polished look, their coats gleaming like trophies, their eyes dull with the lack of any real challenge. Wexley stood at the center, his sharp features framed by the grandeur of his estate, his hands folded behind his back. He was every bit the image of the man who had everything, and yet somehow he still couldn't let go of a petty vendetta. "I've heard enough about this miracle horse," Wexley's voice rang out, cool and mocking. "So, here's my offer, Lane. I'll put my undefeated stallion, Iron Ghost, up against your little Phoenix. A public race. A winner takes the loser's horse." Harper felt the blood drain from her face, but she stood her ground. Josie, who had come along for the ride, clutched her mother's hand, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. The stakes were clear. Phoenix would be taken from her if they lost. Wexley's eyes glinted with cruel satisfaction as he watched Harper's reaction. "You can back out if you'd like, but I'd hate for you to miss the chance to lose your horse and your dignity in front of the our town." For a moment, Harper felt the weight of the challenge pressing down on her, but something else stirred inside her. Her mother's voice, the lessons she had taught her, echoed in her mind. "Don't ever let someone else decide who you are," Anne had told her countless times. And now, standing in front of Wexley, Harper realized she wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for Phoenix. For all the horses that had been thrown away, like scraps of meat. "I accept," Harper said, her voice low but unwavering. The press gasped, the cameras flashing as they captured every second of the moment. Wexley's smug smile faltered for just a second, and then he regained his composure. "We'll see you on the track," he said, turning on his heel and walking away without another word. As the media buzzed, Harper's heart pounded in her chest. She had agreed to a race she had no business entering. She had agreed to put everything on the line for a horse that no one believed in. But she wasn't doing this for fame or for glory. She was doing it for Phoenix and for herself. The odds were 40-1 against her, and Harper knew the town was already betting on her failure. But the thing about people like Wexley, and the thing about this town, was that they didn't understand what it was like to fight when you had nothing left. They didn't understand what it was like to fight for something that no one else believed in. Harper turned to Josie, her daughter's face glowing with excitement, though there was worry in her eyes. "Mom, we can do this, right?" Josie asked, her voice trembling just slightly. Harper smiled, brushing a strand of her daughter's hair behind her ear. "We don't have a choice," she said softly, "but we'll make it count." That night, Harper stood in front of the barn, her eyes on Phoenix. She didn't have the luxury of a trainer, a team, or the equipment Wexley had at his disposal. But what she did have was her heart, and the belief that sometimes the most powerful races were the ones nobody expected you to win. The barn creaked under the weight of another long day, its old wooden beams groaning as if sharing in Harper's exhaustion. Birch Hollow Ranch was far from the picturesque farm that some might imagine when they thought of horse training. It wasn't pristine, it wasn't fancy. But to Harper, it was home. In all its patched-up, weathered glory. It had been her mother's dream, and despite everything, it was still hers too. And now, it was where she would try to build something bigger than herself, something no one believed in. The ranch was barely holding itself together, the grass growing wild, and the fences sagging in places where the wood had started to rot. The front gate had been patched together with spare parts, some mismatched and others just plain worn out. The stalls were the same, and the hay bales stacked higher than ever, spilling over in places where they had once been neatly organized. The tools were old, the equipment outdated. But what Birch Hollow lacked in resources, it made up for with spirit. Harper had always known that her farm was the underdog. She had learned that truth the hard way, as she knew that to make a living here, she couldn't just survive, where she had to make every penny stretch, every day count. And yet, every morning, she was back at it, holding on to the small victories. She had nothing else to give, and nothing else to hold on to. It was the first morning after she had agreed to the race challenge, and the air felt heavier. The weight of the promise she had made was still sinking in. Her mind was spinning with questions she didn't have answers to. Could Phoenix really run against Iron Ghost? Did she have enough time to train him? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, what would happen if she failed? Josie came rushing into the barn, her face flushed with excitement. "Mom, I want to ride Phoenix today." "I think he's ready." Harper glanced over at Phoenix's stall. The bay stallion was still standing there, his large frame casting a shadow in the dim light. He looked calmer now than he had been at the auction, but still, there was something raw, something untamed in his eyes. Harper stepped closer, reaching for the halter hanging on the wall. "Nah, I know, sweetie, but we need to take this slow. He's been through a lot, and we don't want to push him too hard." Josie's face fell slightly, but only for a moment. "I know, Mom. I just want him to be okay." Harper smiled softly, feeling the warmth of her daughter's concern. Josie had always been the heart of the ranch, always in tune with the animals, always ready to comfort and heal. It was a gift, one Harper didn't always understand, but one she treasured deeply. She clipped the halter onto Phoenix's head, and together they led him out of the stall. The sunlight hit his coat, highlighting the scars and imperfections, but also the undeniable strength beneath. He was a horse that had been discarded, forgotten. But he wasn't just any horse. He had heart, and he had the kind of spirit that made people take a second look. For the next few hours, Harper worked with Phoenix. She didn't rush him, she simply asked him to trust her. She worked through the basic movements, allowing him to get used to the weight of the saddle, the feel of the reins, and the sound of her voice. She talked to him the way she would talk to a friend, soft and steady. As she worked, Harper's mind drifted. She couldn't help but think about all the things she had lost over the years. Her mother, her mentor, the dreams she had once held for this ranch. There were days when it felt like nothing was left, when she was just going through the motions, pretending to hold everything together. But there was something different about Phoenix. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't just another animal she was trying to save. He was a reflection of her own brokenness, her own fight to keep going despite everything. "Come on, Phoenix," Harper whispered, her hand gently gliding along his back as she led him in a slow circle. "We'll do this together." Josie was sitting nearby, watching them with wide, hopeful eyes. She hadn't said much, but Harper knew how badly her daughter wanted this. She wanted to believe that they could still win, still make something of this farm, this life. And so, Harper couldn't afford to back down. Not now. Hours later, as the sun began to set and the sky shifted from soft blues to hues of pink and orange, Harper stood at the edge of the pasture, looking out at the land that stretched before her. She had been so focused on the race, on Phoenix, that she hadn't allowed herself to see the bigger picture. Birch Hollow Ranch had once been a thriving place. It had been full of promise and hope, and though it wasn't what it had been, it wasn't too late to rebuild it. Josie joined her at the fence, her small hand resting on Harper's arm. "Do you think Phoenix can really do it, Mom?" Harper looked down at her daughter, her heart swelling with love and hope. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to give Josie the reassurance she needed. But the truth was, Harper didn't know. She didn't know if they could win or if Phoenix was truly the champion they needed him to be. But what she did know was this: they had nothing else to lose. "Yeah," Harper said, her voice steady. "I think he can, but we have to believe in him, just like we believe in this place. And in each other." Josie smiled, her eyes bright with the kind of hope that only children could possess. It wasn't just about a horse. It wasn't just about winning a race. It was about belief. The kind of belief that made even the impossible seem possible. And as Harper stood there, watching the last rays of the sun dip below the horizon, she made a vow to herself. She would do everything in her power to make sure Phoenix had a chance. She would fight for him, or for her daughter, and for the ranch. Because sometimes the only way to rebuild was to start with something that had been written off by everyone else. The barn was still, except for the soft rustling of hay and the rhythmic sound of Phoenix's hooves tapping against the floor. Harper had been working with him for weeks now, and while there had been progress, it was slow. Phoenix wasn't the kind of horse you could rush. He wasn't like the others, those horses that were eager to please, ready to follow commands, quick to trust. Phoenix had scars, visible and invisible, and he wasn't ready to let anyone in. Not yet. Harper knew it wasn't just about training. It was about time, about trust, about showing Phoenix that he was safe, that he wasn't going to be abandoned again. She'd spent hours in the barn with him, talking to him softly, brushing him down, letting him get used to her presence. She never pushed. She never forced. She just waited. And bit by bit, Phoenix began to soften. Slowly, the terror in his eyes began to fade, replaced by something else: curiosity, cautious trust, a flicker of hope. But there were days when it felt like she was making no progress at all. Days when Phoenix would pull away from her, his body tight with fear, his muscles locked in resistance. And on those days, a Harper would stand there, a quiet determination in her chest, reminding herself that this wasn't going to be quick. It was never going to be quick. It was one chilly evening, just as the sun was beginning to sink behind the trees, that things changed. Harper was in the barn, sitting on the hay bales as she always did, her legs tucked beneath her, reading aloud to Phoenix. It had become part of their routine, her voice filling the space around them, the words soothing the silence that had once been so thick and oppressive. This time, she was reading a passage from a book her mother had loved, a story about a horse that had been abandoned, but eventually found its way home. Harper's voice was soft, steady, as she read, her gaze fixed on Phoenix, who stood a few feet away. She didn't look at him with expectation, didn't try to force him to come closer. She just let the words spill into the air, knowing that, in some way, Phoenix was listening, and then something extraordinary happened. As she read the last few lines of the passage, Harper saw Phoenix take a tentative step forward, his hooves barely making a sound against the barn floor. Her breath caught in her throat, and she stopped reading for a moment, unsure if what she was seeing was real. Phoenix took another step, and then another, until he was standing just in front of her, his large dark eyes fixed on her face. For a moment, neither of them moved. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath. Harper slowly reached out, her hand trembling ever so slightly as she extended it toward his muzzle. Phoenix's nostrils flared, and he took a step back. But then something shifted. His head lowered, just slightly, and then, without hesitation, he leaned in, allowing her to touch him. Harper's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the moment settling over her like a blanket. She had been waiting for this moment of connection. And it was finally happening. Her fingers brushed against his coat, the roughness of his fur against her skin, grounding her in that moment. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. Instead, he stood there, still, allowing her to touch him in a way he had never allowed anyone before. Harper's breath came in a shaky exhale as she continued to stroke his coat, the bond between them growing with every gentle motion. She couldn't explain it, but something had shifted. Phoenix wasn't the same horse anymore, and she wasn't the same person. They had both come so far, and this was the first real breakthrough. It wasn't just physical. It was emotional. Phoenix had started to trust her. He had started to believe that she wouldn't hurt him. And that was everything. The next few days were filled with small victories. Phoenix let Harper touch his back. He let her guide him with the reins. And then, one afternoon, as the sun bathed the ranch in golden light, Harper did something she hadn't dared to try before. She climbed onto Phoenix's back. At first, he stiffened, his muscles tensing as though he might bolt at any second. But Harper stayed calm. Her body relaxed, her voice low and soothing. She wasn't in a hurry. She wasn't asking for perfection. She was simply asking for trust. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, ever so slowly, Phoenix took a step forward, and then another, and another. They moved together, the rhythm of his stride syncing with her own heartbeat. It was like they were dancing, two broken souls finding their way. Harper couldn't help but smile, the sense of triumph surging through her chest. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She hadn't forced it. She hadn't tried to rush the process. She had simply been patient, gentle, and above all, she had never given up on him. For the first time since the day she had bought him, Harper allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could do this. They could train for the race, they could compete, and they could win. The next morning, as the sun rose over Birch Hollow Ranch, Harper stood by the track, watching Phoenix stretch his legs in the paddock. He was faster now, more confident, and though he wasn't quite where she needed him to be, he was getting closer every day. As Harper stood there, Josie by her side, watching the horse that had once seemed so broken move with the kind of grace and power she hadn't thought possible, she allowed herself one fleeting moment of hope. They were far from perfect, but they were getting there, together, and that, she realized, was all they needed. The track was empty when Harper and Josie arrived that morning. Birch Hollow Ranch wasn't much of a spectacle. It wasn't the pristine, well-funded facility that the wealthy owners of Wexley's horses were used to. No, this was a quiet stretch of dirt, a place where the only audience was the occasional bird in the trees or a few curious cows in the adjacent pasture. But to Harper, it was the beginning of something bigger than she could have imagined. Phoenix, now steadier and more confident, was ready. So Harper told herself. They had been training for weeks now, every day spent working him through the basics, just getting him comfortable with movement and the feel of the track beneath his hooves. But as she watched him now, walking in lazy circles in the paddock. Harper realized that the quiet, almost tentative animal she had first brought home from the auction had become something else entirely, something more. Harper wasn't sure when the change had happened. Maybe it was the day Phoenix had finally allowed her to touch him without flinching. Or the day he had allowed Josie to brush his coat without pulling away. Maybe it was a combination of everything. But whatever it was, Phoenix had transformed. No longer just a scared animal. He had become something else, an athlete, a competitor. Harper stood at the edge of the track, watching Phoenix's movements with a growing sense of awe. She had seen the power and grace in him before, but today was different. He was more focused, more intense. His muscles rippled beneath his coat as he moved, his movements smooth and fluid. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. It was like he had always known what to do, like the instincts of a champion had finally awakened. "Mom, look at him," Josie said, her voice filled with wonder as she leaned against the fence, her eyes wide with admiration. Harper couldn't help but smile. "He's incredible." "I can't wait to race him," Josie added, her excitement bubbling over. Harper felt a pang in her chest. She was excited too, but there was also a sense of fear that lingered just beneath the surface. The race was coming up, and with it the knowledge that they were up against the best. Wexley's Iron Ghost, an undefeated stallion, the kind of horse that had been bred for success. Phoenix wasn't like that. He didn't have the pedigree, the lineage, or the polished history of Wexley's champion. All they had was heart, and that was something no one could measure. "Let's take him for a run," Harper said, shaking off her doubts. She could see the fire in Phoenix's eyes, the spark of something wild, something that had been buried for so long, and now it was coming to the surface. Harper led him to the starting line, the cool morning air brushing against her skin. She mounted him with practiced ease, her hands steady on the reins, her voice calm as she spoke to him. "Ready, Phoenix? Ready to show them who you are?" He snorted, tossing his head slightly, but Harper could feel the tension in his body, the way he was coiling, preparing to unleash his strength. "Let's go," she whispered, urging him forward. They started slowly, the rhythm of Phoenix's gallop steady but controlled. Harper guided him along the track, letting him stretch his legs, giving him the freedom to find his pace. It wasn't about speed yet. It was about understanding the track, about building trust. But as they neared the far corner, something changed. Phoenix's gait shifted. What had been a steady canter now became something faster, more fluid. Harper's breath caught in her throat as she felt the power building beneath her, felt Phoenix responding to her, becoming more than just a horse. His muscles stretched, his stride lengthening with every step. "Mom," Josie whispered from the sidelines. He's going faster." Harper's heart skipped a beat. She had felt it too. It wasn't just speed, it was control, precision. Phoenix wasn't just fast, he was fast in a way that felt almost unnatural, like his body knew exactly what to do, as if he had been trained for this his entire life. Harper couldn't help herself. She urged him on just a little faster, and Phoenix responded, surging forward with a burst of power that took them both by surprise. The wind whipped through Harper's hair as she clung to the reins, feeling the horse's power beneath her. For a few moments they flew down the track. It wasn't a race, not yet at least, but it felt like one. The sound of his hooves pounding against the dirt was like music, a rhythm that matched the beating of Harper's heart. She could feel it in her bones. This was no ordinary horse. Phoenix was something else. He wasn't just fast, he was a force, a legend in disguise. When they finally slowed, Harper was breathless. Her mind raced, her thoughts swirling in the wake of what she had just witnessed. Had she seen it? Was that real? "Mom, that was amazing!" Josie exclaimed, her voice full of excitement. "He's so fast!" Harper looked down at Phoenix, her heart still pounding in her chest. "He's incredible," she whispered. Harper knew they still had a long way to go, The race was only a few weeks away, and they weren't ready. Not yet. But what she had just seen, what Phoenix had just shown her, changed everything. They had something that no one could measure, no one could predict. The odds were still against them. No one believed they could win. But Phoenix had just given Harper something no one could take away. The belief that they could. And that, Harper realized, was all they needed. It was the kind of news that rippled through the town with the force of a thunderstorm. The buzz started in the small diner where the locals gathered for their morning coffee, passed through the post office, and swept through the stables and pastures of Birch Hollow Ranch. It wasn't just the press that was talking about it. Everyone in town had heard that Richard Wexley, the billionaire with an undefeated stallion, Iron Ghost, had issued a challenge to Harper Lane, and the stakes were nothing less than her horse, Phoenix. The moment the offer had been made, Harper knew this was no longer about her or the ranch. It was about something bigger. It was about proving, once and for all, that even the most broken, the most discarded, could rise and stand alongside the finest. Wexley's challenge wasn't just an opportunity to race. It was a direct challenge to everything Harper had worked for. Harper had no illusions. She knew that Iron Ghost was a superior horse. The stallion had been bred for greatness, trained from a young age, and had never been beaten. He had the best of everything: trainers, facilities, equipment, resources. Phoenix, on the other hand, was a scrap of forgotten potential. He wasn't polished. He didn't have the pedigree, the luxury, or the reputation. But what he had, what they both had, was heart. But Harper wasn't just going to let the challenge pass by. No, this was her moment. This was her chance to prove that there was something worth fighting for. Even in the most unlikely places, the media coverage had gone into overdrive. The papers ran stories about the miracle horse and the underdog trainer. People came from miles around just to see Phoenix, to witness the horse that no one thought could be anything but a failure. The whispers grew louder, the opinions more divided. Half the town was backing Harper, rooting for the underdog. The other half, however, was more skeptical, watching her every move with the kind of scrutiny reserved for the inevitable fall. Josie was ecstatic. She'd been counting down the days until the race, practicing her cheering, imagining what it would be like to watch Phoenix out on the track. She didn't care about the odds. She didn't care about how many people doubted her mother. She just believed in the horse, and she believed in Harper. "Mom, we're going to show them," Josie said, her eyes alight with hope. "We're going to win." Harper smiled at her daughter, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. She wanted to believe it too, but there was a part of her that couldn't shake the weight of the challenge ahead. This wasn't just about a race. It was about proving a point. And it was a race that Harper knew they might lose. But what worried her even more was the darkness she could see starting to creep into Phoenix's spirit. The pressure, the eyes of the world, it was all beginning to take its toll on him. The bond they had built, that quiet trust, was now being tested in ways it had never been before. That afternoon, after they had finished training, Harper took a moment to talk to Phoenix. She had learned not to rush things with him, to let him come to her when he was ready. And right now he seemed restless. His ears flicked nervously, and his once steady gaze was now darting around, as though he was anticipating something that he couldn't quite place. "Hey, big guy," Harper murmured, stepping into his stall. "I know it's a lot of pressure, but we've been through worse, right? And we've got each other." Phoenix let out a quiet whinny, his eyes softening as she approached. His trust was still there, buried under the weight of expectations, but it was there. Harper reached out to stroke his mane, her fingers gently working through the tangles. She couldn't let him see her doubt. She couldn't let him feel the fear creeping into her own heart. "You don't have to be perfect, Phoenix," she whispered. "Just trust me. We've got this." But even as she spoke, the words felt hollow. She didn't know if they were enough. The challenge, the pressure, it all weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had promised herself that she wouldn't let Phoenix down. But what if it wasn't enough? What if they couldn't win? A few days later, Harper received a call from Wexley's office. The race was scheduled, the stakes were set, everything was in place. Harper was nervous, but the voice on the other end of the line was smooth, confident, almost mocking. "I look forward to seeing your miracle horse on the track," Wexley said, his tone dripping with disdain. "I'll enjoy watching Iron Ghost put him in his place." Harper gritted her teeth, holding the phone tightly in her hand. She didn't respond. Wexley wasn't going to intimidate her. She knew what this was. It was a game, a power play, and he was going to learn that not everyone played by his rules. After the call, Harper sat on the porch for a long time, looking out at the ranch. The land that had once been filled with hope, with dreams, now seemed quiet, almost deserted. She didn't know if she was ready for this. But she couldn't back down. She couldn't walk away. Not after everything she had fought for. That night, after Josie had gone to bed, Harper stood in the barn, looking at Phoenix in his stall. The soft flicker of the lantern cast shadows across the walls, and for the first time in weeks, Harper allowed herself to acknowledge the weight of the journey ahead. "Tomorrow, we train harder," she whispered. "Tomorrow, we fight." And as she stood there in the quiet of the barn, Harper finally made peace with the one thing she hadn't been able to admit until now. It wasn't about winning. It was about showing up, about proving that no matter how small or broken you seemed, you could still make a mark. You could still stand tall, even when the world didn't think you belonged. The race was coming, and the stakes had never been higher. But Harper Lane wasn't about to back down. Not now, not ever. The days stretched out like an endless horizon, the pressure mounting with each tick of the clock. The race was just around the corner, and every moment counted. Harper didn't have the luxury of professional trainers, top-of-the-line equipment, or a well-oiled team behind her. What she had was herself, Josie, and a horse no one had believed in. Still, Harper had never been the type to back down from a challenge. She had spent the last few weeks working Phoenix harder than ever before, pushing him to his limits, testing his speed, his endurance, and his resolve. Every morning, they were up before the sun, and every evening, after the chores were done, Harper was back in the barn, running drills, working through the motions, all while the shadows of doubt hung heavily over her. Phoenix was stronger now, his muscles well-defined beneath his bay coat, his stride more fluid and confident than ever. But the stakes were higher than just his performance. Harper knew the entire town, the entire racing world, was watching. The question wasn't just whether Phoenix could win the race. It was whether a nobody like Harper Lane could take down the elite billionaire who had everything at his disposal. The barn had become a sanctuary, a place of calm before the storm. Josie had taken on more responsibility, feeding and cleaning, while Harper spent the rest of her time with Phoenix, pushing both herself and the horse to go further, faster, longer. Every session was a reminder of how far they had come. There were days when Phoenix stumbled, when his body refused to give more, and on those days, Harper would stay up late in the barn, talking to him softly, telling him that they couldn't stop. "We can't give up now, Phoenix," she'd say, her voice low but firm. "We're in this together. We're not turning back." But as the race drew closer, the strain began to show. Harper's body ached from the relentless hours spent on training and in the barn. And though Josie's optimism never faltered, Harper could see the growing concern in her eyes. There was no telling how Phoenix would perform under the weight of such high expectations. The odds were still stacked against them, 40-1, the media continued to report. The underdog story, while endearing, didn't mean much when the horse on the other side of the track was a champion. One evening, just a week before the race, Harper stood at the starting line of the track, Phoenix's reins in her hands, staring out over the dirt. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the empty space. Phoenix stood next to her, his eyes alert, his nostrils flaring as if sensing the importance of the moment. They had spent the day running drills, going over the same pattern again and again. But today, something was different. Phoenix's energy was off. His movements were slower, more deliberate, like he was resisting the effort. Harper could feel his frustration. She had seen it in his eyes. He knew something was coming, and it scared him. "Come on, Phoenix," Harper murmured, tightening her grip on the reins as she led him to the starting line. "Just one more. Let's make it count." But Phoenix hesitated. His legs stiffened, his head lowering as if he could feel the weight of what was about to come. It wasn't just the physical strain of the training. It was the emotional toll. He was a horse who had been discarded, abandoned, and now he was expected to win a race that no one thought he could ever enter. Harper sighed, running a hand through her hair, frustration creeping up her spine. She wasn't sure what was wrong. She had pushed Phoenix hard. Yes, but he was stronger than this. He was capable of so much more. And yet, this moment felt like a wall, a barrier that neither of them could cross. Josie appeared at the edge of the track, calling out to them. Her voice was bright, filled with the same optimism she always carried, but Harper could hear the hint of concern beneath it. "Mom, you've got this." "I know you do. We all do," Josie cheered. Harper smiled at her daughter, but it was thin. "Thanks, sweetie," she said, but the doubt in her voice was impossible to hide. Josie bounced over to them, her small hands reaching for Phoenix's reins, as if trying to connect with him. "We've come this far, right?" she said, looking up at Harper with that unshakable belief. "We're not stopping now?" Harper's heart softened, and she knelt down next to Josie, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. Her daughter was right, of course. They had come too far to stop. There was no turning back now. "Okay, big guy," Harper whispered to Phoenix, looking into his eyes. "Let's show them what we're made of." With a final deep breath, Harper mounted him. They had a routine, and today would be no different. With Josie cheering from the sidelines, Harper urged Phoenix forward, slowly at first, then gradually increasing his pace as they moved down the track. And then something clicked. Phoenix's stride lengthened, his muscles shifting beneath him as he fell into a rhythm that felt effortless. His breathing evened out, and the tension that had been coiled in his body began to loosen. The fear, the doubt, it melted away with every step. Harper's heart raced as they picked up speed, the sound of Phoenix's hooves pounding against the track like the beat of a drum. They were flying. They were moving as one, and for the first time in weeks, Harper felt a glimmer of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Hope. This was it. This was the moment when Phoenix stopped being the underdog. This was when he became more than just a broken horse. This was when he became a champion. As they crossed the finish line, Harper slowed Phoenix down, the world spinning around her as she realized what had just happened. Phoenix had found his stride. He wasn't just ready. He was more than ready. They were going to race, and they were going to fight. The morning of the race arrived with the heaviness of a storm. On the horizon, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, a warning of the weather that would come later in the day. The track, slick with early morning dew, gleamed under the gray sky. The atmosphere was electric, and not just from the potential rain. There was an air of expectation, a collective breath being held by thousands of people who believed in the impossible. And then there was Harper. She stood at the starting line, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest, her hands steady despite the nerves that crept through her veins. This wasn't just a race. This wasn't just a competition between horses. It was everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for. It was the culmination of years of struggle, of heartache, of believing in things when no one else would. It was a moment she couldn't afford to mess up. Harper stood with Phoenix at the edge of the track, the bay stallion's eyes wide and alert, his muscles taut beneath the weight of the saddle. He had come so far. But there was still one more hurdle to overcome. the race itself. And the weight of the world felt like it was bearing down on them. The stadium was packed. There were high-end boxes filled with the kind of people who spent fortunes on horses, betting on every step, every movement. The stands were packed with fans, the energy palpable. It was a spectacle. And right at the heart of it all was Harper Lane, standing next to a horse that had been written off, laughed at, ignored. The announcement came over the loudspeakers, a voice so slick and polished it could have belonged to the owner of every luxury car in the parking lot. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the race of the year, the one we've all been waiting for. Richard Wexley's Iron Ghost, undefeated versus Harper Lane's Miracle Horse Phoenix. This is the race that will decide it all. A ripple of applause swept through the crowd. Harper didn't look up. She couldn't afford to. She could hear them, the whispers, the mocking comments that she could barely drown out, even in her mind. No one thought Phoenix had a chance, and they thought even less of her. Harper glanced over at the Wexley team, and there he was, Richard Wexley, standing in the middle of his entourage like a man who had already won. His arms were crossed over his chest, his smug smile unshakable. His horse, Iron Ghost, was led to the starting line like a prize. He was everything Harper wasn't. Beautiful, polished, undefeated. Wexley looked at her for a moment, his eyes cold and calculating, but there was something else too. A hint of disdain. He knew that this was going to be a blowout. No one believed in Harper or Phoenix. No one believed they could even come close to beating a horse as legendary as Iron Ghost. The horses were led to the gates, the crowd growing quiet in anticipation. The weather was turning, the first drops of rain starting to fall, cold and steady. The track was slicker than anyone had expected, the surface threatening to turn to mud at any moment. The rain had come earlier than predicted, but it wasn't a concern for Wexley. His horse had the best shoes, the best training. Nothing could stop Iron Ghost. Harper swallowed, her mouth dry as she adjusted the reins, taking a deep breath as she leaned forward to whisper in Phoenix's ear. "You've got this. We've got this." Phoenix snorted softly, and for the first time that morning, Harper felt the tension in his body loosen. There was no turning back now. No matter how many people doubted them, no matter how impossible it seemed, this was their moment. The starting bell rang, and the gates flew open. Phoenix surged forward, more powerful than Harper could have imagined. She felt the immediate rush of speed as the stallion's powerful legs kicked into motion, his hooves pounding against the track like a rhythmic drum. But as they approached the first turn, Harper saw the terrifying reality. Iron Ghost was already a length ahead and gaining speed with every stride. But it wasn't over. Harper couldn't afford to panic. She urged Phoenix on, the wet tracks slick beneath their feet, every movement feeling like it could be the one that tipped them into a fall. Phoenix, undeterred, found his rhythm. With each step, Harper could feel the horse settling into the rhythm of the race. Phoenix was quick, but more importantly, he was controlled. He didn't have the flashy speed of Iron Ghost. He didn't have the effortless grace that came with decades of breeding. But what he did have was determination, and it was something that Iron Ghost didn't know how to contend with. The rain started falling harder now, soaking through their clothes, turning the track into a slippery battlefield. But Harper didn't flinch. She didn't care about the rain. She didn't care about the odds. She only cared about one thing: Phoenix. She leaned forward, urging him to push harder to find that last burst of speed. And then it happened. As they hit the final stretch, the two horses were neck and neck. Iron Ghost still held the edge, but Phoenix was coming. Harper felt a surge of adrenaline rush through her heartbeat thundering in her chest. She couldn't lose now. They had come too far. "Come on, Phoenix," Harper urged, the words barely a whisper over the roar of the crowd and the pounding of hooves. "Come on," Phoenix responded, surging forward, his body lengthening with each powerful stride. He wasn't just running, he was flying. With a burst of speed that Harper had never thought possible, Phoenix surged ahead of Iron Ghost. It was sudden, a shocking shift in momentum, and in the blink of an eye, they had passed him. The crowd went wild, their cheers rising above the storm. Harper could barely hear them. She was focused only on Phoenix, only on the finish line that was growing closer with every breath. They crossed the line together, the sound of the hooves silencing the noise around them. Harper's arms were raised in the air, but her mind was blank, her heart still racing. They had done it. Against all odds, against the best of the best, Phoenix had won. Harper's Lane and her miracle horse had defied everyone's expectations. And in that moment, the impossible was no longer just a dream. It was their reality. The track was a blur of flashing lights, chaos, and roaring applause. It felt like the world had been holding its breath for the entire race. And now, as Phoenix crossed the finish line, the collective exhale was deafening. The crowd was on its feet, screaming, shouting, applauding, but Harper couldn't hear any of it. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heart, the heavy breaths of Phoenix beneath her, and the overwhelming disbelief that surged through her chest. They had done it. They had won. Phoenix slowed to a trot, his muscles still rippling with the afterburn of the race. His nostrils flared, his chest heaving as the sweat on his coat shimmered in the rain-soaked light. He was exhausted, but he had given everything he had. And it had been enough. More than enough. He had won. Harper sat tall in the saddle, still trying to process what had just happened. She had been doubted, laughed at, and underestimated. But none of that mattered anymore. They had proven everyone wrong. Phoenix was a champion. She was a champion. The announcer's voice crackled through the speakers, but Harper didn't need to hear it to know what was being said. The crowd was wild, the press cameras flashing like lightning, capturing every moment of the victory. The underdog had done the impossible. But just as the roar of the crowd began to settle, Harper's eyes found a familiar figure standing at the edge of the track. Richard Wexley, the smug billionaire who had mocked her from the beginning, who had doubted Phoenix and laughed at her every move. He was standing there, his arms crossed, his jaw clenched. But there was no smugness now. His expression was tight, forced, as though he had just swallowed something bitter. He didn't approach her right away. Instead, he watched from the sidelines, his gaze narrowing as he processed the loss. Wexley had lost more than a race. He had lost his reputation, his pride, and his bet, and Harper knew that this defeat would hurt more than any financial loss. As Harper dismounted from Phoenix, Josie rushed over, her eyes shining with excitement. "Mom, we did it! We actually did it!" she cried, throwing her arms around her mother. Harper wrapped her arms around Josie, pulling her close. The rain soaked them both, but Harper didn't care. She hadn't felt this alive in years. The weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in so long, Harper allowed herself to feel the joy that had been so elusive. They had done the impossible, and it had been worth every second. But just as they shared their moment of victory, Harper felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned, and there was Wexley, standing there with his characteristic arrogance still intact, despite the sting of defeat. He took a step forward, his gaze locked on Harper, but there was no longer any mocking in his eyes. Instead, there was something else. Something like grudging respect. "You've done it," Wexley said, his voice clipped, his tone colder than the rain falling around them. "I didn't expect this. You've got a hell of a horse on your hands." Harper's gaze hardened, but she kept her voice steady. "I didn't just get a horse, Richard. I got a fighter. Something you clearly wouldn't understand." Wexley's lips twitched in a half smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He looked over at Phoenix, the horse who had defied him, and then back at Harper. "I'll offer you $500,000 for him," he said, his words deliberate, as if he was making a grand gesture. Harper blinked. stunned for a moment. She had expected Wexley to be a sore loser, but she hadn't expected him to try to buy her horse, especially after everything that had happened. She looked at Phoenix, standing proud, his coat still glistening with sweat, and then back at Wexley. 500,000, Wexley repeated, clearly expecting her to take the offer. It's more than enough. Think about it. You could retire, start fresh. No more struggling. Harper stood there for a moment, the weight of the offer hanging in the air. She knew what this would mean. $500,000 was more money than she had ever seen in her life. It was enough to save the ranch. It was enough to give her and Josie the life they had always dreamed of. But it wasn't enough to buy Phoenix. Harper took a deep breath, the answer clear in her mind, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, without hesitation. Some things aren't for sale, she said firmly. Not this, not him. Phoenix isn't a trophy to be bought. And he's family. Wexley's face twisted slightly, the smile falling away. For the first time, he looked genuinely baffled. You've won the race. What's left for you? Why not take the money? It's a fortune. Harper met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. Because it's not about the money, Richard. It never was. It's about proving that things, people like Phoenix, are worth something, that even the discarded can rise. Wexley's expression flickered for a moment, a brief flash of something unreadable crossing his features, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual smugness. He didn't speak again. Instead, he simply turned and walked away, his entourage trailing behind him. Harper watched him go, and for the first time, she felt a sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with winning the race. She had stood her ground. She had proven that sometimes the true victory wasn't in the money or the fame. It was in the belief that the world could be changed by standing up for what was right. As the crowd continued to cheer and the media cameras snapped picture after picture, Harper turned to Josie, who was still smiling brightly at her side. Harper could see the pride in her daughter's eyes, and it filled her heart with something deeper than victory. This is just the beginning, Harper said, her voice soft but full of promise. We're going to build something bigger than just a race. We're going to give other horses like Phoenix a chance. We're going to create a sanctuary for them. For the ones no one believes in? Josie nodded enthusiastically, her eyes bright with the same hope that had fueled them from the start. We'll make it the best place ever, Mom. I know we will. Harper smiled, looking down at Phoenix, who was standing quietly by her side, his eyes calm and steady. He had been the miracle she had fought for, and now he would help her build something that would change the world. The race was over, but their journey was just beginning. But